The back of the VFW hall always smelled like stale beer and wet gravel. It was a scent I'd come to associate with a specific kind of loneliness, the kind that settled deep in your bones on a Friday night in a town where you knew no one and no one really knew you. I wasn't a member, had never even stepped inside. I was just cutting through the parking lot, a familiar shortcut from the library to my small rented bungalow, when the world dissolved into two blinding white headlights. A car door opened and shut with a solid, authoritative thud. My heart, a startled bird, hammered against my ribs. "Hold it right there." The voice was low, calm, and carried the unmistakable weight of law. It wasn't a shout, but it stopped me more effectively than a physical barrier. I froze, my hand still on the strap of my messenger bag, the worn leather cool against my palm. A tall silhouette detached itself from the glare of the headlights and moved toward me. The crunch of his boots on the loose gravel was the only sound in the sudden, heavy silence. He came into the dim spill of the VFW's back security light, and I could make out the uniform. Khaki shirt, dark trousers, a star glinting on his chest. Sheriff Brody. I didn't know him, not really, but in a town the size of Harmony Creek, you knew of everyone. He was a fixture, a quiet presence at town meetings and the annual Founders' Day parade. He was a man who seemed to be carved from the same sturdy, unyielding material as the oak trees that lined Main Street. "Evening," he said, his voice a low rumble. He stopped a few feet from me, his expression unreadable in the shadows. His presence was immense, filling the small space between the building and his cruiser. "We got a call about someone lurking back here." "That someone be you?" My mouth was dry. "Lurking? No, I was just cutting through. From the library. I live over on Elm." I pointed vaguely into the darkness behind me, an utterly useless gesture. My own voice sounded thin, reedy, pathetic. He was silent for a long moment, just watching me. I felt like a specimen under glass, every nervous twitch, every shallow breath, cataloged and analyzed. His gaze was steady, not unkind, but deeply searching. It made me feel transparent. I could smell the night air, cool and damp, and beneath it, something else. The faint, clean scent of ironed cotton and leather from his duty belt. "All right," he said finally, the single word exhaled on a slow breath. "Let's just make sure. Hands on the hood of the cruiser for me, please." It wasn't a question. My mind raced, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, what I could possibly be suspected of. Vandalism? Public intoxication? I'd had nothing but a cup of lukewarm tea all evening. But you didn't argue with a man like that, a man whose quiet confidence seemed to hold the whole night at bay. I walked the few steps to the patrol car, the metal cool and solid under the security light. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. I placed my palms flat against the hood. The metal was still warm. He moved behind me. I didn't hear him so much as feel the shift in the air, the displacement of his body near mine. He was close enough that I could feel a hint of warmth radiating from him. He ran a practiced hand over my pockets, quick and impersonal. A wallet, keys, a phone, my library card. He paused when his fingers brushed the worn paperback in my back pocket. "What's this?" he asked, his voice closer now, right by my ear. "A book," I managed to say, my voice tight. "Poetry. Walt Whitman." I felt, more than heard, a soft huff of air that might have been a chuckle. He didn't say anything else. He just finished the pat-down, his touch professional and detached, yet it sent a tremor through my entire system. He was thorough. When he was done, he stepped back. "You can turn around now, Mr. Miller." Leo Miller. I turned slowly, keeping my hands where he could see them. I finally got a clear look at his face. He was older than I'd thought, maybe mid-30s, with lines etched around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his current stoic expression let on. His hair was dark, cut short and neat. But it was his eyes that held me. They were a deep, steady brown, and they were watching me with an unnerving intensity. "Leo Miller," he repeated, testing the name. He pulled a small notepad from his shirt pocket. "You work at the county library?" "Yes. For about 3 years now." "Right. I've seen you in there." He didn't look up from his pad. "Just taking a shortcut home?" "Yes, Sheriff. I do it all the time. It cuts off the long corner by the hardware store." He finally looked up, and his gaze met mine. For a beat, the world seemed to shrink to the space between us. The stale beer smell, the gravel, the buzzing security light, it all faded away. There was just the quiet hum of the cruiser's engine and the intensity of his eyes. In that moment, something shifted inside me. A quiet, dormant part of my soul stirred, like it was recognizing something it had been waiting for without even knowing it. "All right, Mr. Miller," he said, his professional tone snapping back into place. "Just be careful. Old man Hemlock at the VFW is jumpy. Sees a shadow and thinks it's kids looking to cause trouble." He tucked his notepad away. "You're free to go." But I didn't move. I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the spot. My hands, now hanging awkwardly at my sides, still felt the ghost of the cruiser's warm hood. That was how I met Sheriff Clay Brody, behind the VFW, with my hands on his cruiser and my heart doing a frantic, terrified, exhilarating tap dance in my chest. He hadn't arrested me. He hadn't even given me a warning. But in that brief, tense, and strangely intimate encounter, he had stolen something from me all the same. He'd stolen my peace. My quiet, predictable solitude was over, and I had a terrible, sinking, wonderful feeling that I was never going to get it back. In the weeks that followed our encounter, Harmony Creek seemed to shrink. Or maybe it was just that my awareness of one particular inhabitant had expanded to fill every corner of it. I started seeing Sheriff Brody everywhere. It was the peculiar phenomenon of noticing every single blue car on the road the moment you buy a blue car. Clay Brody was my blue car. I'd be shelving the new fiction arrivals at the library, the scent of fresh paper and binding glue filling my senses, and I'd glance out the large front window to see his cruiser idling at the town's only traffic light. He'd be resting one arm on the open window, his fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the door. I'd watch the way the sunlight caught the silver in his hair at his temples, the set of his jaw as he scanned the street. He never looked my way, but the sight of him was enough to make my pulse quicken, my hands fumble with the books. He became a study, a subject of intense, silent observation. I learned his routines from my perch behind the library's checkout counter. He got coffee at the corner diner every morning at precisely 7:15. Black, 2 sugars. I knew this because I'd started taking my morning walk an hour earlier just to pass the diner and catch a glimpse of him through the window, sitting alone in a booth by the front, reading the local paper. He'd hold the paper with one hand, his other wrapped around a thick ceramic mug, his expression thoughtful. I saw him at the gas station, leaning against his cruiser while the tank filled, his thumbs hooked into his duty belt. He had a way of standing, a stillness that was utterly commanding. He wasn't a large man, not in a bulky, imposing way, but he occupied his space with a solid, grounded presence that drew the eye. He moved with an economy of motion, nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Every action was deliberate, from the way he screwed the gas cap back onto the nod he gave old man Fitzwilliam, who ran the station. My life, which had been a quiet, ordered collection of days, was now punctuated by these sightings. They were like little jolts of electricity, waking me from a long slumber I hadn't even realized I was in. My world had been black and white, the comfortable, muted tones of old books and quiet evenings. Clay Brody was a sudden, unexpected splash of color. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. I started cataloging the small details. The way one corner of his mouth tilted up slightly when he was listening to someone, a ghost of a smile. The slight rasp in his voice when he said, "Morning," as we passed on the sidewalk, a sound like stones tumbling in a slow river. The way he wore his uniform, not stiffly, but with a comfortable familiarity, as if it were a second skin. One afternoon, a gaggle of teenagers were being loud and obnoxious in the young adult section, and I, in my infinite capacity for non-confrontation, was trying to work up the courage to ask them to quiet down. Before I could formulate a sentence that didn't sound like a plea, the library doors chimed and Sheriff Brody walked in. The air in the room changed. The teenagers' boisterous laughter died in their throats. They straightened up, suddenly fascinated by the spines of the books on the shelves. Clay didn't even look at them. He walked directly to my counter, the soft thud of his boots echoing in the sudden, reverent silence. "Leo," he said, his voice that same low rumble. He used my first name. My heart did a stupid little flip. He placed a book on the counter. It was a well-worn copy of Lonesome Dove. The cover was creased, the pages soft from countless readings. "Returning this for my dad," he said. "He says it's the best book ever written. I think he's read it about 20 times. It's a good one, I managed, my fingers trembling slightly as I took the book. Our hands brushed. It was nothing. A fleeting, accidental contact. But it felt like a brand. A spark arced from his skin to mine. A tiny, shocking current that shot straight up my arm and settled somewhere deep in my chest. I pulled my hand back too quickly. I fumbled with the scanner, my mind a complete blank. I am a librarian. I check out books. This is the primary function of my existence. Yet, in that moment, I couldn't remember how the simple machine worked. He was just standing there, watching me, his expression patient. That unreadable look was back in his eyes. Was it amusement? Annoyance? Or was it something else? I finally managed to scan the book, the beep of the machine sounding ridiculously loud in the quiet room. All set, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Thanks. He didn't leave right away. He lingered, leaning one arm on the counter. He smelled of fresh air and that clean cotton scent again. Quiet day. They're all quiet days, I said, and then immediately regretted it. It sounded so sad, so pathetic. I was pathetic. But he didn't seem to think so. That ghost of a smile touched his lips. Nothing wrong with quiet. He glanced over at the now silent teenagers, who were trying to melt into the bookshelves. Then he looked back at me. Keeps people out of trouble. His eyes held mine for a fraction of a second too long. It was a loaded moment, a silent acknowledgement of our first meeting behind the VFW. He knew. He remembered. The heat rose in my cheeks. He gave a small nod. Have a good afternoon, Leo. And then he was gone. The library doors chimed his exit, and the room seemed to exhale. The teenagers scurried out a moment later, their bravado gone. I was left alone in the silence, my hand still tingling where his had touched it. Nothing wrong with quiet, he'd said. But the quiet he'd left behind was different. It was charged, heavy with unspoken things. It was a silence that hummed with possibility, and it was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. My analysis of Clay Brody became a full-time, unpaid, and deeply obsessive occupation. Every brief interaction was a text to be deconstructed, every glance a mystery to be solved. My brain, so accustomed to the quiet order of the Dewey Decimal System, tried to apply the same logic to him. It was a futile effort. He was a chaotic variable in the neat equation of my life. A nod across the street as I was leaving the bakery, a warm scone clutched in my hand. Was it a simple, neighborly gesture? Or did his eyes linger for a second longer than necessary? I replayed the moment 100 times, trying to decipher the precise angle of his head, the subtle shift in his expression. It was madness. I was turning into a caricature of a lonely man, spinning fantasies from the barest of threads. Then there was the incident at the post office. I was mailing a package to my sister, fumbling with the tape and the customs form, when he came in. The little bell over the door announced his arrival, and my focus shattered. He joined the line behind me, and the space suddenly felt charged, the air thick. I was acutely aware of him standing there, his quiet presence a weight against my back. "Morning, Leo," he said. That voice. It vibrated right through me. "Sheriff," I squeaked, turning slightly. I offered a weak, trembling smile. "Morning." He just nodded, his gaze steady. He was holding a small stack of envelopes. Official-looking things. I turned back to my package, my hands now completely useless. The tape stuck to itself. I dropped the pen. My cheeks were burning. I could feel his eyes on me, a calm, patient weight. He wasn't judging my incompetence, or if he was hiding it well. I finally managed to get the package ready and slid it across the counter to Martha, the postmistress, who had been watching our non-interaction with undisguised curiosity. As I turned to leave, I had to pass him. The aisle was narrow. "Excuse me," I mumbled, trying to shrink myself. He stepped back to give me room, and his hand came up, resting lightly on the small of my back to steady me as I passed. It was the most casual of gestures. A polite, thoughtless touch. But it was not thoughtless to me. It was a 5-alarm fire. His palm was warm and solid against the thin fabric of my shirt. The touch lasted for maybe 2 seconds, but it imprinted itself on my skin, on my memory. I could feel the exact shape of his hand, the slight pressure of his fingers. Every nerve ending in my body lit up, screaming in a chorus of pure, unadulterated panic and want. I was out the door and halfway down the block before I could take a full breath. I didn't look back. I couldn't. That single, fleeting touch was a revelation. It confirmed a terrifying truth. My quiet, academic admiration for the town sheriff had morphed into something deeper, something physical and undeniable. It was a full-blown, hopeless, mortifying crush. The touches, when they happened, were always small, always plausibly deniable. They were crumbs, and I was starving. A few weeks later, the town council held a meeting about funding for the library's summer reading program. I had to give a short presentation. Public speaking was my own personal version of hell, and I'd spent the entire day feeling sick with anxiety. Clay was there, sitting in the back of the community hall, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression impassive. His presence made my anxiety spike into the stratosphere. I stumbled through my speech, my voice shaking, my notes a blur in my trembling hands. I talked about budgets and engagement metrics, my words sounding hollow and ridiculous. I could feel the council members' eyes glazing over. I was dying up there. When I finished, there was a smattering of polite applause. I scurried back to my seat, my face hot with shame. As the meeting droned on, I just stared at my hands, wishing the floor would swallow me whole. After it was all over, as people were milling about, gathering their things, I felt a presence beside me. It was Clay. "You did good," he said quietly, his voice pitched just for me. I looked up at him, surprised. I was terrible. I think I put half of them to sleep. "No," he said, and his eyes were serious. "You were passionate. You believe in what you're doing." That came through. He paused. "They voted to approve the full funding, by the way, while you were staring at the floor." My head snapped up. "They did." He gave that slight, one-sided smile. "They did." He reached out and squeezed my shoulder. It wasn't a pat. It was a squeeze. His fingers pressed into the muscle, firm and reassuring. "Good job, Leo." His hand lingered for a moment, his thumb rubbing a small, comforting circle against my collarbone. Then he dropped his hand and was gone, melting into the crowd heading for the exit. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the warmth of his hand still radiating through my shoulder, down my arm, and straight into my heart. He had listened. He had noticed my distress. He had waited to tell me the good news in person. And he had touched me. It was a gesture of comfort, of congratulations. But for me, it was everything. It was a confirmation that he saw me. Not just the quiet librarian, but me. And that simple act of being seen by him was more terrifying and more wonderful than anything I had ever felt. The quiet equation of my life wasn't just chaotic anymore. It was starting to feel like it might actually be solvable. The universe, it seems, has a twisted sense of humor. Or maybe it just likes to force emotionally constipated librarians into situations they are profoundly unequipped to handle. My 1998 sedan, a beige box of fading reliability I'd affectionately named the Biscuit, chose to die on a Tuesday afternoon. Not on Main Street, in front of the mechanic's garage. No, it died on Old Creek Road, a winding, tree-lined stretch of asphalt with no shoulder and even less cell service. I stood on the side of the road, popping the hood for reasons I couldn't fathom. I knew as much about car engines as I did about quantum physics. I stared at the greasy, complicated mess of metal and wires, hoping that a stern look might intimidate it back to life. It did not. The silence of the woods pressed in on me, broken only by the chirping of birds who were, I was sure, mocking my incompetence. After an hour of pointless tinkering and increasingly desperate attempts to find a single bar of cell signal, I resigned myself to a long, sweaty walk back to town. I had just started my trek when I heard the familiar crunch of tires on a gravel turnout behind me. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat with a mixture of hope and dread. It was his cruiser. Of course, it was his cruiser. Clay pulled up beside me, the engine a low, comforting rumble. He rolled down the passenger window. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice calm and even. He was wearing sunglasses, hiding those intense eyes, but I could feel his gaze on me all the same. "The Biscuit has passed on to the great junkyard in the sky," I said, trying for a light tone and failing miserably. I gestured helplessly at my dead car. "She won't start." He killed the engine and got out, leaving the driver's side door open. The radio was on, tuned to a classic rock station, the volume low. He walked over to my car, moving with that easy, deliberate grace of his. He leaned under the hood, his broad shoulders filling the space. I found myself staring at the way his khaki uniform stretched across his back, the solid lines of his body. I quickly looked away, my face growing warm. He tinkered for a few minutes. his hands moving with a confidence I could only dream of. I could hear the clink of metal, a soft curse under his breath. I just stood there awkwardly, feeling like a useless appendage. Finally, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag he produced from his back pocket. "Well, I'm no mechanic, but I'd say your alternator's shot." He looked at me, pushing his sunglasses up onto his head. And there they were. Those eyes. Direct. Steady. "You're not going anywhere in this thing today, right?" I said, my shoulders slumping. "That's fantastic. Come on," he said, gesturing with his head toward the cruiser. "I'll give you a lift back to town. We can call Fitzwilliams to come tow it." Getting into the passenger seat of his patrol car felt strangely illicit, like I was crossing some invisible line. The inside smelled like him, that clean scent, mixed with coffee and something vaguely metallic. The cab was neat, organized. A computer was mounted to the dash, a sturdy-looking shotgun was locked in a rack between the seats. It was his world, and I was just a visitor. The drive back to town was quiet at first. The dispatcher's voice crackled from the radio occasionally, a calm, female voice reading out license plates and addresses. It was the soundtrack to his life. "So," he said, breaking the silence. "The biscuit." I felt my cheeks heat up. "It's beige. And old." It seemed fitting. He chuckled. It was a low, warm sound that seemed to vibrate through the seat. "I get it. My first truck was a beat-up Ford, the first called the Rust Bucket for similar reasons." It was the first time I'd heard him really laugh. It changed his whole face, softening the stern lines around his mouth, making the creases by his eyes deepen. I found myself smiling, a genuine, unforced smile. "So, what does a librarian do when his car dies in the middle of nowhere?" he asked, his tone shifting from amused to genuinely curious. "Primarily, panic," I admitted, followed by a period of intense self-recrimination for not knowing how to fix an alternator. Then, finally, a grim acceptance of a very long walk. He glanced at me, and his smile lingered. "Sounds about right." He turned his attention back to the road. "You're not from around here, are you, Leo?" The question was simple, but it felt significant. He was asking about me. He wanted to know. "Is it that obvious?" I asked. "You don't have the Harmony Creek accent," he said. "And you walk too fast." I laughed. "I'm from the city. Philadelphia. I moved here about 3 years ago. Needed a change of pace. Or rather, a dramatic reduction in pace." "Big change," he noted. "You like it?" "The quiet." There was that word again. Quiet. The word he'd used in the library. "Most of the time," I said, my voice softer now. "Sometimes it's too quiet." The admission hung in the air between us, more vulnerable than I'd intended. I had just told him I was lonely. He didn't respond right away. He just drove, his hands resting easily on the steering wheel. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, contemplative. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "I know what you mean," he said. "I grew up here, left for the army for 10 years. Saw a lot of the world. A lot of loud places. When I first came back, the silence was deafening." I looked at his profile. The strong line of his jaw, the focus in his eyes as he watched the road. He had just shared something real, a piece of himself that wasn't Sheriff Brody, but Clay. He was letting me see past the uniform, past the star on his chest. He was showing me a crack in his stoic facade, a moment of softness that mirrored my own vulnerability. "Why did you come back?" I asked, emboldened by his candor. He was quiet for a long moment. "My dad was the sheriff before me. His health started failing. It was time for me to come home. Take over. This town, it's in my blood, I guess. For better or worse." He glanced at me again, a quick, assessing look. "Someone's got to look out for it." We pulled into town, and he drove me right to my front door. He helped me call the tow truck and waited until I was safely inside before he left. As I watched his cruiser pull away, the red and blue lights silent, I felt a profound shift. We had been stranded on that quiet country road, 2 men in a bubble of unexpected intimacy. He had towed more than just my car that day. He had towed me out of my self-imposed isolation, just for a little while. And he'd shown me that his quiet wasn't one of emptiness, but of depth. He was a man who understood silence. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, he might be able to understand mine. The incident with the broken-down car became a new baseline for us. The invisible wall of his uniform and my shyness had been breached. Our interactions, though still brief, were now threaded with a new sort of familiarity. His mornings were warmer, his nods accompanied by that small, one-sided smile that made my stomach swoop. He started stopping by the library more often, not just to return his father's westerns, but to, as he put it, check the perimeter. It was a flimsy excuse, and I think we both knew it, but I clung to it. He'd lean against the checkout counter, asking about my car, which was now fixed and running, albeit grudgingly. He'd ask if I'd finished the Whitman book he'd found in my pocket that first night. He remembered. The thought sent a thrill through me. We'd talk about books, about the town, about the weather. Small talk. But with him, it never felt small. It felt like we were building a bridge, plank by plank, across the chasm of our respective solitudes. The real tipping point, however, came not in the quiet halls of the library, but in the noisy, crowded chaos of the annual Harmony Creek Founders' Day picnic. It was a mandatory town event, a celebration of cornhole, lukewarm potato salad, and deeply ingrained local gossip. I usually made a brief appearance, ate a hot dog, and fled. But this year, the library had a booth for the summer reading program sign-ups, and I was manning it. I was trapped. For hours, I smiled and handed out bookmarks until my face ached. Clay was there, of course, not in his cruiser but on foot, weaving through the crowd. He wasn't in his uniform, but in a simple pair of jeans and a dark gray t-shirt that stretched across his chest in a way that was profoundly distracting. He was still on duty, his badge and sidearm clipped to his belt, but he looked different, more relaxed, more approachable, more Clay. He stopped by my booth, a bottle of water in his hand. "Selling a lot of books?" he asked, a teasing glint in his eye. "Giving away a lot of free pencils," I retorted, holding one up. "It's a literary frenzy." He laughed. That low, wonderful sound. "Need a break? I can watch the pencils for you for a few minutes." The offer was so unexpected, so kind, that I could only stare at him for a moment. "Really? You don't have to do that." "I want to," he said, his expression sincere. "Go get a burger. You look like you're fading." I let him take over, feeling a ridiculous surge of gratitude. As I was walking toward the food tent, I passed by a group of men huddled near the beer garden. One of them was Dale Huckabee, a man who owned a local construction company and possessed a mouth as big as his ego. I'd had the displeasure of dealing with him when he disputed a library fine for 3 months. As I passed, I heard Dale's voice, loud and laced with cheap beer. "Well, look at that. The sheriff's playing librarian. Wonder what kind of books those two are reading together." He snickered, and his buddies joined in. It was a snide, ugly sound. The implication was clear, a casual bit of homophobic venom meant to be overheard. A cold knot of shame and anger tightened in my stomach. This was why I kept to myself. This was the undercurrent of small-town life I tried so hard to ignore. I kept my head down, my pace quickening. I just wanted to disappear. "You got something to say, Dale?" Clay's voice cut through the air like a whip. It was not his calm, Sheriff Brody voice. This was something else. It was cold, hard, and utterly menacing. I stopped, turning back just in time to see Clay standing a few feet from Dale's group. He had moved so silently, so quickly, I hadn't even seen him leave the booth. Dale, who was a good 50 pounds heavier than Clay, suddenly looked small. He stammered, "No, Sheriff. Just joking around." Clay took a slow step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet intensity radiating from him was more intimidating than any shout. "Leo is a friend of mine," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And I don't appreciate your jokes, we clear." The air crackled with tension. Dale's buddies were suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. Dale swallowed hard, his face pale. Yeah, Sheriff. Crystal clear." Clay held his gaze for another long, punishing second before turning his back on them. He walked over to me, his expression shifting from icy fury back to a controlled calm, but I could see the anger still simmering in his eyes. He had defended me. He had called me his friend in front of everyone. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft now, for my ears only. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. He put a hand on my arm, his grip firm, grounding. "Don't pay him any mind. He's an idiot." He started walking me away from the crowd, toward the quieter edge of the park near the creek. He didn't let go of my arm. His touch was a shield, a statement. We stood by the water, the sounds of the picnic fading behind us. The tension was a living thing between us, a thick, humming wire. He had stood up for me, put himself between me and the ugliness. The sheer, unexpected force of his protection left me breathless. It was more than friendship. I knew it, and I had a feeling he knew it too. The pretense was gone. Something had been confronted, and now we had to deal with the fallout. Later that evening, long after the picnic had ended and the park was empty, I was sitting in my living room, trying to read. The words on the page were just black squiggles. My mind kept replaying the scene with Dale Huckabee, the cold fury in Clay's voice, the steady, protective weight of his hand on my arm. A knock on my front door made me jump. I opened it to find Clay standing on my small porch. He was back in his uniform, the setting sun glinting off his badge. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced. "Evening," he said. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look uncertain. "Sheriff," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Is everything okay?" "Just wanted to check in," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. He was looking at his boots. "After this afternoon. Make sure you were all right." "I'm fine," I said, though it was a lie. I was anything but fine. I was a jumbled mess of gratitude and fear and a hope so fierce it hurt. "Thank you for what you did." He finally looked up, and his gaze was raw, exposed. He had no right. The words were quiet, but they were filled with a conviction that resonated deep inside me. He wasn't just talking about Dale's comment. He was talking about something bigger. The air between us was thick with all the things we weren't saying. The silence stretched, filled with the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of my own heart. This was it, the loaded interaction, the moment where subtext screamed louder than any words could. "Do you want to come in?" I asked, the invitation feeling momentous, a turning point I couldn't take back. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then gave a single, decisive nod. "Yeah, I'd like that." He stepped inside, and I closed the door behind him. My tiny house suddenly felt even smaller with him in it. He filled the space, his presence a tangible force. He stood in the middle of my living room, looking around at my overflowing bookshelves, the stacks of novels on the floor, the mug of cold tea on the coffee table. He looked out of place, a solid, real-world figure in my quiet, book-lined sanctuary. "You have a lot of books," he stated, the observation obvious but somehow profound. "It's an occupational hazard," I said, trying for a joke. It fell flat. The tension was too high. He turned to face me. We were only a few feet apart, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the slight stubble shadowing his jaw, close enough to smell the starch on his uniform and the faint, lingering scent of the fresh-cut grass from the park. "Leo," he started, then stopped. He swallowed, his throat working. He, Sheriff Clay Brody, the comm center of Harmony Creek, was nervous. The realization sent a jolt of courage through me. He tried again. "What Dale said today. You don't have to explain," I cut in quickly. "Or apologize. You did nothing wrong. You defended me." "That's not it," he said, his voice low and intense. He took a step closer. My breath hitched. He wasn't wrong. Not entirely. My world tilted on its axis. My mind went blank. I could only stare at him, trying to process what he'd just said. He wasn't wrong. "I haven't been stopping by the library just to check the perimeter," he continued, his eyes locked on mine, pinning me in place. "And I wasn't just being neighborly when I gave you a ride home. I think you know that." I did. I had known it in my gut, in the secret, hopeful corners of my heart. But hearing him say it, seeing the undisguised vulnerability on his face, was something else entirely. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. "Why?" I whispered, the single word all I could manage. "Why me?" The quiet, awkward librarian. The city mouse who didn't fit in. He took another step. We were inches apart now. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between us for a heartbeat before he gently, tentatively, cupped my jaw. His thumb brushed against my cheek, and the touch was electric, 1,000 times more potent than the fleeting contacts that had come before. This was deliberate. This was intentional. "Because," he said, his voice a rough whisper, "from the moment I saw you standing behind the VFW, looking so lost and out of place with a book of poetry in your pocket, I haven't been able to get you out of my head." That was it. The breaking point. The confession I had never, in my wildest dreams, allowed myself to hope for. My carefully constructed walls of solitude and self-preservation crumbled into dust. All the yearning, all the observation, all the silent, hopeless pining, it had all led to this. To him, standing in my living room, his hand on my face, his truth laid bare in his steady, beautiful eyes. The air left my lungs in a rush. I could feel the slight tremor in his hand, a mirror of the one that was shaking my entire body. He was waiting for me to run, to deny it, to shatter this fragile, impossible moment. But I didn't run. I leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. It was my answer. His eyes darkened, a flicker of relief and something hotter, deeper, passing through them. His thumb stroked my skin, a slow, mesmerizing rhythm that seemed to sync with the frantic beat of my heart. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was a question and a statement all at once. My name on his lips was a prayer. And then he was closing the distance between us. The world narrowed to the space of a single breath. It wasn't a rushed or frantic movement. It was deliberate as everything else he did. He gave me time to pull away, time to say no. I did neither. I met him halfway. His lips touched mine. It wasn't like the kisses in movies. There were no fireworks, no swelling orchestral score. It was better. It was real. His lips were firm, warm, and surprisingly soft. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question. He tasted of coffee and courage. I responded with all the pent-up longing I had held inside for months, a silent confession of my own. The hesitation vanished. His other hand came up to my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. My hands, of their own accord, found their way to his chest, bunching the stiff fabric of his uniform shirt in my fists. The kiss deepened, becoming a slow, searing exploration. It was a conversation we couldn't have with words, a release of all the tension, all the stolen glances, all the unspoken questions that had hummed between us for so long. This was not the touch of a sheriff, or a stranger, or even a new friend. This was the touch of a man who had seen me, truly seen me, and had decided to stay. It felt like relief. It felt like acceptance. It felt, more than anything else, like coming home. He broke the kiss slowly, resting his forehead against mine. We stood like that for a long time, just breathing each other in. My eyes were closed, but I could feel his breath on my face, warm and steady. I could feel the solid, reassuring beat of his heart under my palm. "Okay," he whispered, his voice rough. I opened my eyes. His were inches from mine, dark and searching. I couldn't find my voice, so I just nodded. A slow, shaky, but definite nod. A small, real smile finally broke across his face. It was the smile I had only seen ghosts of before, and it was devastatingly beautiful. He laced his fingers with mine, his large, warm hand engulfing my own. The simple act of our fingers intertwining felt more intimate, more binding, than the kiss itself. It was a promise, a beginning. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. It was the comfortable, peaceful quiet of two people who had finally found their way to the same page, in the same book, after a long and patient reading. The story was just beginning, and for the first time in a very long time, I couldn't wait to see what happened next. I woke to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through my bedroom window. For a disoriented moment, I didn't know what was different. Then it all came flooding back. Clay's confession, the kiss that had unraveled me, the hours we'd spent talking on my sofa, our voices low in the quiet of the night. He hadn't left. He had stayed. He was asleep in my bed, beside me. I turned my head slowly on the pillow. He was on his back, one arm flung over his head, the other resting on his stomach. In sleep, the stern, watchful lines of his face were gone. He looked younger, more vulnerable. His breathing was a deep, even rhythm in the quiet room. The sight of him, so solid and real in my bed, in my life, sent a wave of panic and wonder through me. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet cold on the wooden floor. I gathered my clothes and tiptoed out of the room, closing the door softly behind me. In the living room, his uniform shirt was slung over the back of a chair, his duty belt coiled neatly on the coffee table next to my half-read book. The symbols of his authority, of the man the town saw, looked strangely domestic in the soft morning light of my home. I went into the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the churning sea of my emotions. My mind was racing. What now? What did this mean? Last night had been a dream, a fantasy spun from months of yearning. But the morning was real. Morning was consequences and questions and the potential for crushing disappointment. What if he regretted it? What if, in the cold light of day, he saw this as a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment? The thought was a cold fist clenching in my gut. He was Sheriff Brody. He had a position in this town, a reputation to uphold. I was me, the quiet librarian, an outsider. The coffee maker gurgled, filling the small kitchen with its rich, dark scent. I leaned against the counter, my head in my hands. The silence from the bedroom was deafening. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. My overthinking brain was a cruel master, spinning out a dozen different scenarios, each one more painful than the last. He would wake up, get dressed without a word, and leave. He would be polite, distant. He would say it was a mistake. Our fragile, nascent connection would be shattered, and I'd be left with nothing but the ghost of his kiss and the unbearable memory of this morning's hope. I heard a floorboard creak in the bedroom. My heart hammered against my ribs. This is it. He's awake. I held my breath, listening for the sound of the door, of his boots on the floor, of his retreat. Instead, I heard the soft rustle of sheets, and then silence again. I poured 2 mugs of coffee, my hands shaking so badly I sloshed some on the counter. I wiped it up with a paper towel, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I was stalling. I was a coward. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I picked up the mugs and walked back toward the bedroom. I had to face this. Whatever was coming, I had to face it. I pushed the door open with my shoulder. He was sitting up in bed, the sheet pulled around his waist. He had scrubbed a hand through his hair, making it stand up in soft, dark tufts. He looked rumpled and sleepy and impossibly handsome. He was watching the door, waiting for me. His expression was unreadable, that familiar, stoic mask back in place. The fist in my stomach tightened. I made coffee, I said, my voice sounding unnaturally bright. I walked over and offered him a mug. He took it, his fingers brushing mine. The small contact sent a jolt through me. Thanks, he said, his voice thick with sleep. He took a sip, his eyes never leaving my face. The silence stretched, taut and heavy. I stood there, holding my own mug, feeling like I was awaiting a verdict. He took another sip of coffee, then set the mug on the bedside table. He looked at me, his gaze direct, searching. Leo, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Come here. My feet felt like lead. I moved to the side of the bed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He reached out and took my free hand, his grip warm and solid. He didn't say anything else. He just held my hand, his thumb stroking gently over my knuckles. And in that simple, deliberate touch, the tension in the room dissolved. The anxious scenarios my brain had concocted evaporated like mist. It wasn't a gesture of goodbye. It wasn't pity. It was reassurance. It was a quiet, nonverbal promise. I woke up, he said, his voice still rough with sleep, and you were gone. I thought for a second that I'd dreamed the whole thing. He looked from our joined hands up to my face. A small, tired smile touched his lips. I'm glad I didn't. The relief that washed over me was so profound it almost made my knees buckle. I sank down to sit on the edge of the bed. I thought you might have regretted it, I admitted, the words a barely audible whisper. He squeezed my hand. Regret is not a word that's in my head right now, Leo. He lifted my hand and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to my knuckles. The only thing I'm thinking is that I haven't slept this well in years. His honesty was a gift. It unknotted the fear in my chest, leaving behind a warm, spreading sense of peace. He wasn't running. He was here. He was staying. The morning I had dreaded had become something beautiful, a quiet, intimate confirmation that last night wasn't an ending, but a beginning. We decided to face the town together. It was Clay's idea, a suggestion so bold it took my breath away. Let's go get breakfast, he'd said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. At the corner diner. The corner diner was not just a restaurant. It was the central nervous system of Harmony Creek. It was the hub of all information, the court of public opinion. Going there, together, on a Wednesday morning after he had clearly spent the night at my house, was not just having breakfast. It was a statement, a declaration. Walking through that door with him felt like stepping onto a stage. The cheerful chatter of the diner patrons faltered, then dropped to a low, curious hum. Every head turned. Every eye was on us. I could feel the weight of their stares, their speculation. My instinct was to shrink, to look at the floor, to become invisible. But then Clay's hand was on the small of my back, a firm, steady pressure. It was a silent message. I'm here. We're in this together. I lifted my chin and met the curious gazes. Morning, Betty, Clay said to the waitress, his voice as calm and easy as any other day. Table for two. Betty, a woman with a beehive of silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, recovered first. A slow smile spread across her face. Right this way, Sheriff, she said, her tone holding a note of what sounded, surprisingly, like approval. We sat in a booth by the window, the same one where I'd watched him drink his coffee alone so many times. The irony was not lost on me. As Betty poured our coffee, the buzz of conversation in the diner slowly returned to its normal level, but it was different. It was charged with a new topic. Us. I could feel the glances, see the heads leaning together over plates of eggs and bacon. The whispers were like the rustling of leaves, just at the edge of my hearing. It was exactly what I had always feared, being the subject of gossip, of judgment. Don't mind them, Clay said quietly, his eyes on mine, not on the rest of the room. He seemed completely unbothered, a calm island in a sea of curiosity. Let them talk. They'll find something new to worry about by lunchtime. You say that like it's easy, I said, wrapping my cold hands around my warm coffee mug. It's not easy, he admitted. It's just necessary. I'm not going to hide, Leo. Not with you. His words were a shield. His steady presence beside me, his complete lack of shame or apology, was an anchor. He wasn't just weathering the storm of small-town gossip. He was calming it, just by being himself. He ordered his usual pancakes. I got toast I couldn't imagine eating, and we talked. We talked about nothing and everything, creating a small, intimate bubble in the middle of the crowded diner. And slowly, I began to relax. I watched him interact with the townspeople who stopped by our table. He was the same Sheriff Brody he always was, polite, respectful, a man in command of his world. But now, I was a part of that world. And by his quiet, unwavering inclusion of me, he was telling the whole town that I belonged there, right beside him. It was the ultimate test of our new, fragile connection, and we were passing it, one cup of coffee, one shared glance at a time. The days that followed settled into a new, quiet rhythm. Our relationship wasn't a secret, but it was private. It unfolded in the small, in-between moments. It was Clay stopping by the library at closing time, not with an excuse, but with a simple, ready to go home? It was me making dinner for two at my little bungalow, the smell of roasting chicken filling the space that had once felt so empty. It was falling asleep with the solid weight of his arm around me, a silent promise that I wasn't alone. We were learning each other, not through grand pronouncements, but through the accumulation of tiny details. I learned that he hummed, slightly off-key, when he was concentrating. I learned he had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, and would steal bites of my dessert with a guilty look that wasn't fooling anyone. I learned that he carried a deep, quiet grief for his mother, who had passed away years ago, a grief that surfaced only in the late hours of the night. He, in turn, learned my quirks. My obsessive need to have the books on my shelves perfectly aligned. My tendency to quote poetry at inappropriate moments. My deep-seated fear of thunderstorms, a holdover from childhood that left me jumpy and anxious. One night, a summer storm rolled in, the thunder rattling the windows of my little house. I was trying to pretend I was fine, but my clenched fists gave me away. Clay simply pulled me against his chest, his hand stroking my back, his body a shield against the noise and the flashing lightning. He didn't tease me or tell me it was nothing to be afraid of. He just held me until the storm passed, his steady presence a silent reassurance that I was safe. One Saturday, he drove me out of town, deep into the wooded hills that bordered Harmony Creek. He pulled his truck up a long, overgrown driveway and stopped in front of a small, rustic cabin. It was old, made of dark wood, with a wide front porch and a stone chimney. "What is this place?" I asked, looking at the quiet, secluded cabin. "It was my grandparents'," he said, his voice soft with memory. My dad and I fixed it up after I got back from the army. I come up here when I need to think. When the town gets too loud. He pulled a key from his pocket. It was on a simple metal ring, alongside the key to his truck. He slid it off the ring and held it out to me. My breath caught in my throat. I want you to have this, he said, his eyes serious. So you can come up here whenever you want. With me or without me. For when the town gets too quiet. I stared at the key in his palm. It was just a small piece of brass, worn smooth with use. But it was so much more than that. It was a key to his sanctuary, to the quietest, most private part of his life. It was a key to a future. It was an act of profound trust. I took it from him, my fingers closing around the cool metal. Play, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I had no other words. He just smiled, that slow, beautiful smile that was reserved only for me. Let's go inside, he said. I'll make us some coffee. We spent the rest of the day at the cabin. We didn't do much of anything. We drank coffee on the porch, watching a family of deer graze in the clearing. He showed me the ridiculously lopsided bookshelf he and his dad had built. I read to him from a worn paperback I found on the mantelpiece. The quiet between us was no longer something to be analyzed or feared. It was a shared space, a comfortable blanket woven from trust and mutual understanding. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we sat on the porch swing, my head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around me. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the soft creak of the swing. This was it. This was the peace I had been searching for when I moved to this small town, a peace I had never truly found until now. I had come here seeking solitude, thinking it would protect me. But true peace, I was discovering, wasn't about being alone. It was about being with the right person, in a quiet so full of love it was louder than any noise. I thought back to that first night behind the VFW, the fear and confusion, the feeling of being exposed under his steady gaze. He had put my hands on the hood of his cruiser and turned my entire world upside down. He hadn't stolen my heart, not really. He had unearthed it. He had found the quiet, hidden part of me that had been waiting, patiently, through all the lonely years, to be seen. He shifted beside me, pressing a soft kiss to the top of my head. You okay? He murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. I smiled, a real, bone-deep smile of pure contentment. I tilted my head back to look at him, at the man who had become my anchor, my sanctuary, my home. Yeah, I said, my voice full of a certainty I had never known before. I'm okay. In his eyes, I saw my own reflection, and for the first time, the man looking back at me didn't look lost or lonely at all. He looked like he was exactly where he was supposed to be,